Right. So these two right here that we just talked about, less cynical, more open. I think these are because of basically the neural structure in children. In other words, kids are growing neural connections like crazy that later on get sort of trimmed based on use. And so that openness that we're talking about, there's actually a biological basis to it. It's not just a matter of how they think, like, oh man, they just have these great ideas. No, it's kind of the other way around. Their ideas are kind of stupid. But being open to the possibilities and more flexible, that has its own value on top of everything else. Just like if you have, if you got $1,000 stashed away, there's value to having that extra 1,000 stashed away, which makes it worth more than actually worth a little bit more than 1,000.
Absolutely.
And that's where interest comes from. The possibilities of the future. I think that's part of where when we're talking about the wisdom of the child, we might be talking about the discovery of a child, the curiosity. I guess
I would say this might be so. As an adult, you start to wonder if you could have the knowledge without the wisdom. In other words, if you could have the knowledge of the things, of certain things like that work on a technical basis, and then see the world through the eyes of a child again, you can perceive how you would restructure things in your own world, how you would handle things differently, not on a wisdom-based level because you wouldn't have that experience, but on a technical level, like in terms of the small technicalities of life, the way you handle these little situations that you do only learn from experience, but are technical things. And I think a lot of times what parents want to do with children, their own children and others, is they want to relive their life through that child, that's why, CDI, live like a child, but basically with that knowledge of these technicalities of how the world's structured today. And then that's, I think, where the envy comes in. And envy, of course, relates to idolization as well. And there's a lot of enviousness.
It goes up on the first list, though. Whoops, wrong color.
Yeah. I mean, you'll have, this might sound dramatic, but, the way a parental household is structured with their children at the time when the children, if there's multiple in the household, begin to get married and begin to have their own families. That family, that entire family, not just that immediate family where there might have been some idolization going on between like a father and a son or a daughter and a mother, but the extended families, the new families, all of them will have these additional issues as that family works through their idolization issues because of how they didn't.
When you say idolization issues, you mean basically like kids waking up to the fact that their folks are people?
Not even that. Well, to a certain extent, it becomes that. But really, it starts at the sense of as the child begins to expand their own opportunities, they get married, they have, they have their own families growing and children growing, and the parent begins to realize they can no longer live their life through the eyes of their child. They can no longer kind of have this redo in their minds. They then get this kind of, sometimes, I'm not saying all the time, level of resent that starts to take place, and you have like this controlling component come in between either a son and a father. That's called the tyrannical father syndrome, or the overbearing mother syndrome, where the mom and the daughter, and they kind of battle it out for hierarchical structure. And that all comes from the idolization that takes place.
That's interesting. One of the things I thought of that I held in reserve, and you just tagged on it, and let me show you what it is. You'll appreciate this. What happens when the kids start to idolize themselves?
Uh-huh. Perfect.
When they start to say, we know better than you.
Exactly.
When they start to look to themselves and become like self-feeding. That's when they become capable of being led as well.
Yeah. At the moment they become thinking for themselves, or at the moment they become, saying, you know what? These teachers, they didn't even know their shit anyway. Hey, teachers, leave these kids alone. They open themselves up to two things you touched on. One, being able to adopt their own principles and values, but it's going to be a hard process. Or two, and more likely the case, unfortunately, is they start being led by something or someone else. They start following a different track. And so they're vulnerable in this moment. And a lot of times that happens. That's why you see a lot of these households have fractured families when that dynamic takes place, when the mom or the father can't let go of control of the child, idolization-wise.
Or like the kid spirals out, and because they had that break the idolization, now they've also lost a level of trust.
With not just trust with their parent, who might have been their confidant, likely was, trust with themselves, because their own trust was built on not having to trust themselves. Their trust, like the child in this instance, their trust was built on being able to blindly trust their idol, the mother or the father. And when they can no longer have that, and they're aware of that, a lot of times you have this response for 6 to 12 months. It's almost like a PTSD type response, because they've had this picture in their head for so long that was ideal. It was force fed there by the parent who idolized the child. Because if the parent idolizes the child, the big thing there to remember is that the parents cannot let the child think that the parent is somehow not good. So the parent spends their entire life trying to paint this picture of them being perfect to the child. And so when the child realizes the parent's not perfect, there's a 6 to 12 month PTSD-like response to that, where it's like they're trying to grapple.
Wait, who gets the PTSD?
The child. A lot of times the parent will eventually have a response like that if they come to terms with themselves. The parent is the one who has to come. The parents are a lot harder in this case because they're oftentimes in their late 50s, 60s, mid 60s. So they have to grapple with 30 years. The child has to grapple with their childhood, so that's a big challenge there. But for the kid, who's oftentimes the first one to realize it, they go through a PTSD-like experience. How can this be true? My whole life, I didn't have to make any decisions because this person made all the decisions because I knew they were right, but now I know they're wrong. And so that kind of, I knew they were right, now I know they're wrong. What makes you do is question everything you've ever given them power of. So every choice you gave them power of, it might have been where you went to college at. It might have been, where you bought your first house, right? A lot of children will make decisions based on pleasing their parents in these situations. And so now that that child realizes that parent who idolized them wasn't perfect the whole time, because at this point, there's an idolization going both ways. There's this fracture that takes place where the child is trying to overcome. I should have gone to IU instead of Purdue. And then it's like, well, if I would have gone to IU, would I even be married to the person I'm married to? And so all of these poisonous thoughts come into their head because they no longer trust themselves. That's where the 6 to 12 month PTSD type period comes in.
So I'm drawing a picture here. A very horrible bell curve.
I find it perfectly fine bell curve. It's a Liberty bell curve. It has a crack in it.
You can see it's not quite a normal distribution. And this is just to throw down a concept. As I was thinking about examples of kids who got idolized, or kids who idolized others to some outrageous extent, and I can think of things like on one far end of this, I might say we got Bobby Fischer. You ever heard of his story?
Oh yeah.
Like he got crazy in the chest, but he didn't kill anybody, and he didn't destroy anybody's lives. He just was really, really weird with his sort of idolization of chess legend and chess moves. On the very far end of that, when you're talking about legendary idolization of kids, are we really talking about Michael Jackson?
Oh man, yeah. Do you remember the discussion we had about people being so talented and so idolized from such a young age? that you see a lot of those kind of people have these fractures, early adulthood, late adulthood, like middle adulthood?
Who are some other examples that you can think of?
Man,
there's a lot of kids.
Macaulay Culkin, who recovered well from it. You got Macaulay Culkin. I mean, if you want to talk about like young adults, you've got like Culkin. Who's was it Dana Plato went through a lot of that? Yeah.
Is it possible that Miley Cyrus is going through some of that now?
You have Miley Cyrus. You have a lot of Britney Spears had to be,
she went a little bit nuts, didn't she?
Yeah, she was inpatient at one point. So, I mean, you have a lot of these situations show up over history. You said Plato. Edgar Allan Poe died on a bench. I have another unrelated theory that when you're in the top 0.1% of most talented, it's really hard of a specific thing. It's hard for your brain to really hold that. So it's a challenging thing. It's the difference between.
The bell curve was wrong. It's not the bell curve. It's not the normal distribution. We're talking about the Pareto distribution. Like the bulk of people are, way down here, all the people that just had normal childhoods and they sort of look up to their parents and have to get over it. Up here are all the weird kids that have these ridiculous childhoods where this normal human instinct.
The Olsen twins.
On your child and, be open to the possibility that they've got some good ideas and trust your mom and dad because they have to, there's some crazy, outrageous ends to these kinds of
okay, and here's a great example then. So add the Olsen twins on here, but Macaulay Culkin had to get custody of some of his younger siblings because he was robbed by his parents, basically. They basically took a lot of his money that he had made on these movies, and he basically fought for emancipation and to gain some custody of his kids. So that was his response to finding out his parents were not perfect human beings.
Didn't Gary Coleman have that kind of thing going on too?
Yeah.
Where his parents were just sort of sucking off him like parasites?
Yeah. And I want to make sure we underscore, this goes both ways. So sometimes the parent can be a very objective parent and the child doesn't want to grow up and they idolize the parent. And in those cases, though, you'll have a lot of split thinking because the child doesn't ever grow up. And so they idolize and want to be like the parent. Since they can't, they resent the parent. So you'll see sometimes in those extreme cases, that's when you'll see a child, kill a parent. That's extreme. But what you'll see more often is that child lives in the basement and shouts at the parent a lot of times and goes back and forth.
And we're talking about the insulation again.
Yeah.
We idolize them so we protect them from the world. And so they don't have to ever be, they don't have to develop their own critical abilities. So they never actually get past that sort of, or that's what they hope, right? They want to keep the kid dependent. They want to keep them producing those records or those shows or what have you.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. Yeah, they want suspension of critical analysis, a suspension of critical viewpoints. That's exactly what they want. And sometimes it takes an objective person entering their lives to switch that up. And what's sad is, and I want to say this on the parental front, there's a lot of times these parents have come from their own fractured childhoods, and so they have their own insecurities. By the time the child comes out of it in these circumstances, they awake. A lot of times when they are able to get through it, they feel a lot of empathy towards the parent, because the parent, if they ever come to it, it's a challenging thing. It's their basically 60, 70 years of suspending their self-critical analysis. So if you can imagine 7 decades of not analyzing yourself objectively, and then all of a sudden you do it, can you imagine how challenging? So it's hard for me to even fathom that. If you didn't look at yourself in an objective way ever for 6 to 7 decades, and then all of a sudden your child coming out of their idolization phase kind of forces you to look at yourself in that manner. And a lot of times that happens in these dynamics.
Especially if you're talking about like those celebrity dynasty type places.
Yeah.
What was the worst one I ever saw? Oh, it was so cringy. Liza Minnelli in the movie Arthur.
Yeah.
It's an ancient movie. I realize that. but she was Judy Garland's daughter, and she kind of had that entitled insulated thing. I think Barbara Streisand gets a lot of crap about that too.
Yeah.
When you talk about these ancient child stars that grow up, and that's the thing. When people talk about them putting, Greta up on.
Great example, actually. We'll stick with we'll hit Greta in a minute. Now, I mean, hey, not literally hit her if we have any, easily offended watching.